Hello, I'd like to thank Vasilis Antoniadis and the rest of the organizers for inviting me here today. This is an extremely interesting workshop, and I have already listened many different theoretical and methodological approaches and case studies. Back in January, I was in another workshop about borders in Crete. In that presentation, I followed an interdisciplinary approach to highlight the relation between the spatial distribution of tombs and the course of the main roads connecting Knossos to Heraklion. By combining the archaeological and topographic evidence and least cost path analysis, I formulated the following hypothesis. If the early Iron Age harbor of Knossos lay in the area of the Venetian port at Heraklion, then there was a main road suitable for wheel transport connecting Knossos to its harbor and flanked by early Iron Age tombs. This road had a similar but not identical course to the modern Knossos Avenue. What, however, I didn't have time to do in a 20-minute presentation was to explain in depth all the decisions I had to take regarding the GIS tools I used to compute the optimal paths. One could ask, however, who cares? Why we should explain everything about our methodology? I think this is one of the biggest problems that we often face when we attempt to reach with our papers the part of the academic community which isn't very experienced with GIS, or, and this is far worse, we think they take for granted whatever we write. Imagine that this paper wasn't about GIS but pottery, and instead of providing you with the drawings, the photographs, the months and color description, and the provenance of, let's say, amphoras, I would just say to you that I discovered a Dressel 25 without further explanation. I think that this kind of information would be utterly useless. So my view, and I think most of the scholars and colleagues here share it, is that regarding GIS implementation is that if we want to communicate with a wider academic audience, we should be as analytical as possible in our papers. And nowadays, this is much easier with digital supplements and publications. Today, I will attempt to highlight all the technical decisions I took in order to reconstruct the course of the early Iron Age road connecting Knossos to Heraklion. A road, apart from its basic use, which is to connect places and facilitate transport, is at the same time a place in itself, an open space where all sorts of events occur. I'll just mention the religious and funerary processions which can be perceived as part of a broader cultic experience. In funerals, for example, there is a ritual that takes place on the road. It is the procession known as ekphora in classical Greece. Plutarch, in his account on Solon's funerary legislations in archaic Athens, mentions that mourners weren't to go out at night except in the funeral cart with a light to show the way. And as we can see in these images, apart from carts, chariots were also involved. And this applied especially in the early Iron Age, where big men and aristocrats participated in funeral games, copying, in a sense, Homeric warriors. Ancient roads were often flanked by tombs, and they function as the last resting place of the deceased. In this plan, you see in red, or in reddish, the prominent position that roads held in the urban and funerary landscape of classical Athens at Keramikos or at the Acharnian Road. The reason for highlighting the nature of roads and the presence of chariots and carts in funerals is related to the method they followed to compute the optimal paths connecting Knossos to its harbor. While humans can walk and climb almost anywhere, wheeled vehicles face serious limitations related to the critical slope, which is a term that mostly applies to the movement of such vehicles. It means a slope on which a driver of an errant vehicle is likely to overturn. Roads suitable for wheel transport have a critical slope ranging between 8 to 12%, sometimes at 15%. I only know one example of a Roman road in Germany, mentioned by Mela Herzog, with a critical slope at 20%. And on the relation between tombs and roads, there's a very interesting paper by Kalopef for my senior, and I'm very happy that she's here today. So, to calculate the cost of ancient roads, I used least cost path analysis, which is, as you already heard, a GIS tool that computes the optimal route from one location to another according to a friction cost on an accumulated cost surface. Cost can be working time, which I normally use, calories, or even money in another sense for a bus ticket. Cost is calculated normally in GIS by functions which use slope rasters derived from the terrain analysis of digital elevation models, the DEMs. Apart from the slope, one may consider terrain roughness or even combine different factors such as land use and water bodies. This is an example of a DEM from Knossos area. You see the cells of the raster in the magnified image. And very quickly, this is how these computations work on a cost-weighted raster, normally with the aid of Dijkstra's algorithm. In the first case, all cells have the same value or the same cost weight, and the optimal path is a straight line from point A to B. In the second raster, the traveler has to move through the cells which cost less than 5. In this case, 5 represents a very steep terrain, such as cliffs. In performing such analysis, we should also consider closely which is the most suitable DEM. It has been observed that DEMs with low resolution, let's say over 30 meters per cell, are too smooth to represent the morphology of the landscape. On the other hand, DEMs of very high resolution, between 2 and 5 meters per cell, show modern modifications such as highways or the Venetian fortification of Heraklion you see here, which may distort the least cost path output significantly. One must not forget that these computations are nothing more than a prediction of a path. After all the satellite data used in the digital elevation models provide us with information on the Earth's current morphology. If, however, we combine least cost paths with archaeological evidence such as wheel racks or cart roads, and this mostly applies in the Peloponnese, stone slabs of paved roads, miliaria for the Roman period, and tomb clusters, then we might reconstruct accurately the course of an ancient road. Having all this information in mind, we may proceed to the case study. Constituting one of the major exceptions to the general rule of sudden changes in the Aegean, Knossos remained relatively prosperous after the late Bronze Age, and this is indicated by contemporary burial finds. Recent archaeological evidence from the Knossos Urban Landscape Project suggests that already in the proto-geometric period, there was an extensive settlement near the abandoned Minoan palace. Okay. Can I show? No, I can't. Okay, no. Is the polygon you see just by the palace? Stylianos Alexeou had supported the view that different burial grounds represented different villages, while Nicholas Coldstream had argued that a main settlement housed most of the people buried in the north center. According to Kotsonas, Whitelaw, Basilakis, and Berdaki, an important reason for choosing the right site must have been related to the terrain morphology. Constructing a chamber tomb requires for its dromos a favorable slope and soft limestone. Social divisions could also be related to the existence of sites at a considerable distance from the settlement. And as I have discussed elsewhere, the deposition of Near Eastern imports and Minoan objects in certain tombs supports this view. Today, I argue that there is another reason, which is the proximity of the tombs to the roads. Apart from the need for public display during the funeral processions, wheeled vehicles had to approach the same tomb more than once. Chamber tombs in Knossos accommodated many burials of different generations, and for this reason, they had to be reopened, and some of them quite frequently. In this map, you see the tombs dating to the Minoan and the early Iron Age, not only in Knossos, but also from the area of modern-day Heraklion. To avoid bias regarding the location of the early Iron Age harbor, I've used various sets of data, including two different starting points. In the first case, the center of the early Iron Age settlement, and in the second case, the Minoan palace. Instead of using a single ending point, I used 55 random points at about 40 meters distance to each other. They covered the entire seafront of Heraklion, extending from the western wall of the Venetian fortification to the Keratos River mouth. The reason I'm putting together all this data, and especially the Minoan and early Iron Age tombs, is to compare the distribution in relation to the associated harbors. We see that for those departing from the early Iron Age settlement, the orange line, the orange row, there is only one way for getting at the Venetian harbor, and this way passes through Knossos North Cemetery. On the contrary, those living in the palace area, the white row, avoid this cemetery and they go first at Agios Ioannis after passing by a few Minoan tombs. No doubt, the Minoan harbor town at Poros in Katsabas is better correlated with the location of the palace, the arrangement of Minoan tombs, and probably with Minoan roads. To compute the least cost path in an isotropic cost surface analysis, I ran various trials with different slope-dependent functions for pedestrians at first, and the outputs were very similar. These optimal paths you see here were generated by using Dobre's function. According to this function, it takes 1 hour and 10 minutes to get from Knossos to the port, and 1 hour and 20 minutes for the opposite direction. I must confess, however, that other functions, such as Knight-Smith's formula, could work better in different regions. One of the best ways to test the travel times and distance of the least cost path is either to walk and measure the same distance, as I did in this case, or to compare them with travel times provided by those who walked in the same areas before the advent of major mechanized transport and road building projects. That in Greece would be before the Second World War. Now, this is a map with least cost paths for wheeled vehicles with a critical slope at 10%. Irmela Herzog created this function. Now, because cars can't go anywhere, there are fewer paths in comparison to those used by the pedestrians. Well, there are functions and studies that calculate the travel times and velocity of wagons and pack animals. But in this case, I prefer not to give a suggestion, since we're talking about funeral processions and cultural factors which may slow down a lot a path, the walk time of the path. Now, if we isolate the ending points around the Venetian port, it becomes very clear that this must have been the main road connecting Knossos to its early Iron Age harbor. North of Atsalenion, as you see in the map, the road would have been forked into two branches to move around the eastern hills of the city. So, to get at the harbor by car or chariot, to carry products, or to accompany funeral processions, one had to pass by tombs dating in their vast majority to the early Iron Age. In fact, 4 horse burials were discovered at Knossos North Cemetery, and 2 of them contained the bones of 2 horses probably used in chariots during funerals. In another tomb, horse bits of a harness were found as grave offerings. This probably means that few of the horses which took part in those processions never left the burial sites. It's worth mentioning that the most important and one of the earliest tombs of the entire cemetery, tomb 200, 201, 202, was found very near the road at a distance of about 30 meters. even more important is that this was a pit cave grave which didn't have a dromos and didn't require a favorable slope like all the chamber tombs around it. So it's very tempting to think that it was deliberately placed near the road. This could mean that the road from Knossos to Heraklion was already in use before the first sub-Minoan burials. Arthur Evans and later Sinclair Hood and David Smythe suspected that there was a road already established in the Minoan period leading northwest to Heraklion. However, I think that what made this road absolutely significant was the establishment of a new harbor at the very end of the late Bronze Age, the harbor which is now the modern Heraklion. I hope that with this presentation, I have demonstrated that combining GIS tools with archaeological data and ancient testimonies is not an easy nor a straightforward process. And we, as archaeologists working on the very demanding field of landscape archaeology, we should be as open and as analytical as possible regarding the implementation of GIS and dissemination of our research. Thank you.